It's 2:38 a.m. on a cold Wednesday in late February 2026. Inside a quiet conference room in Geneva, Russian diplomats are shaking hands over bottled mineral water, projecting calm, measured confidence. The public choreography of possible peace. 800 miles to the east, the mood is very different. In a low-lit bunker on the outskirts of Poltava, a Ukrainian FP-1 drone operator sits motionless in front of his screen. He isn't reacting. He isn't rushing. He's waiting for a window that has taken 11 days to open. The targeting package has already been approved, revised, and approved again. The mission was scrubbed twice by weather. Timing slipped. Conditions weren't right. Tonight, they are. The airspace is thinner. The diplomatic spotlight is elsewhere. And for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the window is open. In roughly 47 minutes, a $240 million Russian chemical and munitions logistics facility in Smolensk Oblast, a site Moscow has long treated as comfortably out of reach, is about to be tested by something Russian planners believed Ukraine could not reliably deliver from 700 miles away. Today, we're breaking down how Ukraine executed one of the deepest precision drone strikes of the war, slipping through an air defense network that, for one critical night, was watching in the wrong direction. February 2026, Dorogobuj, Smolensk Oblast. On most maps, the city barely stands out. It sits roughly 220 miles southwest of Moscow, far from the daily rhythm of frontline reporting. For much of the war, Ukrainian strike planners treated it the same way Russian commanders did. Valuable, yes, but logistically out of reach. At least, that was the assumption. Because the PJSC Dorogobuj facility here is not just a fertilizer plant, despite what the public brochures suggest. Ukrainian GUR intelligence had been quietly tracking the complex for nearly 8 months. Buried inside the sprawling Soviet-era footprint sits a secondary logistics node tied to precursor chemicals used in Shahed drone fuel production, along with warehousing linked to KH-101 cruise missile guidance components. In practical terms, this site sits several steps upstream in Russia's strike pipeline. Hit the front line, and you damage output for a day. Hit the supply chain behind it, and the effects travel further. But reaching Dorogobuj was never the easy part. Smolensk is deep. Deep enough that the air defense architecture between the Ukrainian border and the facility reads less like a single shield and more like a layered exam in denial coverage. S-400 batteries positioned near Bryansk and Smolensk can track high-altitude movement hundreds of miles out. Beneath that umbrella, Pantsir S-1 units form an uneven but dangerous inner ring around priority infrastructure. And across the entire corridor, Krasukha 4 electronic warfare systems have been aggressively jamming GPS signals since late 2025. Ukraine had already tested this route, twice. Both attempts failed. Inertial guidance drifted under heavy jamming. Flight paths bent. Impact points missed by miles. On paper, the corridor looked effectively sealed. So Ukrainian planners did what they have increasingly done throughout this war. They stopped trying to force the door and started looking for the seams. Inside GUR planning rooms, the revised route picked up a quiet nickname, the Ghost Corridor. And on this February night in 2026, it is being used for the first time. 1:51 a.m. The launch sequence begins from 3 dispersed positions in Kharkiv and Poltava oblasts. Ukraine sends 14 FP-1 drones into the night sky, each one weighing about 441 pounds at takeoff and carrying a 110-pound warhead. They aren't all going to Dorogobuj. Only 6 of them are. The other 8 are playing a completely different game. Those 8 split immediately after launch, pulling northeast toward the Bryansk Oblast border. They're flying loud and relatively high, 400 feet, on a heading that screams Bryansk Oil Depot, a target Ukraine has hit before. The Russian early warning network picks them up inside 4 minutes. The S-400 battery near Bryansk lights its engagement radar. Pantsir crews at 2 forward positions start cycling through target solutions. In the Russian command net, there's no panic, just that practiced efficiency of a crew that's done this 100 times. They've seen Ukrainian swarms before. They start tracking, start engaging. The first 2 FP-1 drones are knocked down at 70 miles. Clean kills. The remaining 6 Bryansk-bound drones do exactly what they were programmed to do. They don't run. They don't evade. They continue flying straight toward the Pantsir coverage zone at the same altitude, demanding that those radar systems stay active, stay loud, and keep their attention locked northwest. Every second those Pantsir crews spend building track files on a fake attack is a second they're not looking south, and south is where the real 6 are running. The 6 Dorogobuj drones had dropped to 80 feet the moment they crossed the Desna River Valley. They're threading along the river's natural contour, using the tree-lined banks as a terrain shield from the Smolensk S-400's search radar. At 80 feet above the water, they don't exist on that radar picture. They look like background noise, like geese and river fog and electromagnetic scatter off the ice. The Krasukha 4 jamming is hammering the GPS bands hard enough that 3 of the 6 drones lose partial navigation lock inside the first 40 miles. But this time, Ukraine expected that. These 6 aren't running on GPS at all. Their primary navigation mode is visual terrain correlation, a digital map matching algorithm that compares what the onboard camera sees with stored satellite imagery frame by frame, the way a person recognizes their own street in the dark. You don't need to see the road sign if you've driven that road 1,000 times in your head. The jamming doesn't touch optical sensors. The drones keep flying. 2:14 a.m. The Bryansk decoy drones have now drawn the full attention of 2 Pantsir batteries and the Bryansk S-400 into a sustained engagement. 4 more FP-1s have been shot down. 2 are still airborne, still flying straight and stupid and obvious, bleeding the Russian magazine one expensive interceptor at a time. Each Pantsir missile that goes up to swat a $30,000 drone costs Moscow between $500,000 and $1 million. The math is ugly for Russia even before the real strike arrives. At this point, the Dorogobush package is 180 miles into Russian territory, and the crew in Poltava is watching 6 green icons creeping steadily northeast on their ground control display. The operators are calm, but nobody's relaxed. The Smolensk Pantsir ring is still active. 2 units guarding the highway interchange northeast of Roslavl have their search radars turning. The corridor between those 2 units is approximately 22 miles wide. Tight, but workable if the drones stay low and don't do anything stupid. Then one of the 6 drones stutters. A sensor glitch. A brief camera freeze caused by condensation on the lens in the freezing river air. For about 9 seconds, Drone 4 is flying partially blind, its terrain correlation processor locked in a holding loop. The operator watching the telemetry sees it immediately. He doesn't grab the manual controls. The fiber optic link at this range can't support real-time manual flight with the latency involved. Instead, he sends a pre-programmed correction pulse, a stored waypoint override that forces the drone to trust its inertial measurement unit and hold its last good heading for 15 seconds while the sensor recalibrates. It's a 15-second gamble on a 700-mile mission, with 2 Pantsir radars close enough to ruin everything. The drone holds heading. The lens clears. The terrain correlation algorithm finds its reference frame again, matches the bend in a frozen tributary below, and locks back on course. 9 seconds of blind flying, 15 seconds of held heading, and the drone never deviated more than 1,312 feet. The corridor holds. The Pantsir beams sweep past without a hit. 2:29 a.m. The Dorogobush package is 40 miles out, and now the operators face the final problem. The facility itself is protected by a local Pantsir S-1 unit and a battalion of Tor M2 short-range air defense systems that Ukraine's satellite coverage had flagged as recently repositioned, meaning their exact location is an educated estimate, not a confirmed coordinate. There's a roughly 3-mile zone around the target perimeter where the exact threat geometry is uncertain. The Tor M2 is nasty at low altitude. Its radar is optimized specifically to kill small, slow, terrain-hugging targets. If those systems are where Ukraine thinks they are, the 6 drones have a survivable approach angle from the southwest, using a rail embankment and a line of industrial grain silos as terrain masking for the final 4 miles. If the Tor units have shifted position by more than a mile in either direction, the math changes badly. The lead operator makes a call. He splits the 6 into 2 groups of 3. The first 3 go in on the estimated safe approach line, southwest, low, following the rail embankment. The second 3 climb to 250 feet and accelerate, making themselves visible, making themselves loud, demanding a response. If the Tor units light up to chase the high group, that radar emission tells the low group exactly where the threat is and confirms or denies the position estimate in real time. If the Tor units stay dark and engage optically, the high group eats the intercept, and the low group still has a clear lane. Either way, Ukraine learns something useful in the next 90 seconds. The Tor M2 operators at Dorogobush aren't asleep. They've been tracking the engagement at Bryansk on their command net, and they know something is coming. They just don't know what or from where. When the 3 high-altitude drones pop up 18 miles to the southwest and start accelerating, the Tor battery commander makes the natural decision. He lights his engagement radar, builds a track file, and prepares to fire. The radar emission lasts 11 seconds before his first missile leaves the rail. In those 11 seconds, The low group of 3 FP-1s has already processed the TOR's radar position, confirmed it matches the estimated location within 1,969 feet, and locked their terminal approach vectors into the gaps in the coverage envelope. The 3 decoys are shot down at 12 miles, clean, professional, exactly what Russia trained for, and completely beside the point. 2:38 a.m. The low group crosses the facility perimeter at 60 feet, moving at just under 200 miles per hour. The onboard cameras are now broadcasting real-time imagery back through the fiber optic ground relay station that Ukraine's special forces had pre-positioned 7 weeks earlier in a forest 55.9 miles from the target, a detail the GUR had been sitting on since January, waiting for exactly this mission. The imagery is sharp. The facility is partially lit, with a cluster of truck-mounted tanker vehicles visible near the eastern storage bunkers, almost certainly the precursor chemical shipment that Ukrainian intelligence had flagged as arriving 3 days earlier. The lead drone ignores the tankers. Its warhead is a fragmentation type, not ideal for large area denial. It's targeted at the smaller cinder block annex attached to the main production hall's south wall, the structure that thermal imaging had consistently shown running elevated temperatures at odd hours, the signature of precision electronics testing rather than chemical production. That's where the KH-101 guidance module components are being staged. The first drone hits the annex at roof level. The 110-pound warhead punches through the prefabricated concrete ceiling and detonates inside. The overpressure collapse is immediate. The annex roof folds inward, the walls blow outward, and a secondary fire ignites within 4 seconds from what is almost certainly stored synthetic lubricant or circuit board solvent, the kind of thing you keep on shelves in electronics testing areas, and the kind of thing that burns hot and mean and is almost impossible to extinguish with standard suppression foam. The second drone hits the connecting corridor between the annex and the main production hall. This is deliberate. The corridor is the nerve system between the guidance component staging area and the chemical production line. Severing it doesn't just destroy the junction, it isolates the fire to the annex, preventing Russian firefighters from accessing it from the main building, guaranteeing the burn time extends long enough to destroy everything inside. The third drone goes wide. A Pantsir vehicle that wasn't on any Ukrainian threat map, a fourth unit, previously hidden under camouflage netting in a tree line 2,625 feet north, fires a burst of 30mm rounds and clips the third drone's right wing. It spirals in and detonates against the perimeter fence 656 feet short of the secondary chemical storage tank farm. Not the intended target. But the explosion tears a 131-foot section of perimeter fencing down and ignites a diesel fuel cache stored in the equipment yard, which burns for the next 6 hours and keeps the entire facility in lockdown. In Geneva, the Russian delegation is reportedly still in procedural discussions about the format of a proposed ceasefire monitoring mechanism. It takes them 22 minutes to be informed that something significant has happened at Dorogobuj. By then, the 3 surviving FP-1 drones have already run out of fuel and gone dark somewhere over the Desna. The operators in Poltava are watching satellite feeds. The annex is still burning. The corridor is gone. The guidance component staging area, representing, by GUR estimates, roughly 4 weeks of accumulated KH-101 guidance module production, has been reduced to a very expensive fire. Let's do the ROI breakdown, because this one's worth your time. The 6 Dorogobuj-bound FP-1 drones cost Ukraine somewhere in the neighborhood of $180,000 total. The 8 Bryansk decoys, probably another $240,000. Call the whole package $500,000, including the fiber optic relay station, the intelligence investment, and the 2 aborted launch attempts. In exchange, Ukraine destroyed an electronic staging facility tied to a weapon system that costs Russia $13 million per missile to manufacture. 4 weeks of guidance module output is conservatively 15 to 20 missiles. That's $200 to $260 million worth of future KH-101 production capacity that doesn't exist anymore, plus whatever the diplomatic damage is of getting caught running a cruise missile components depot inside a civilian chemical facility, while your diplomats lecture the world about Ukrainian aggression at a Swiss conference table. You can't put a dollar figure on the irony, but you can absolutely put one on the incompetence. The lesson here is the same one Ukraine keeps teaching and Russia keeps failing to learn. Distance is not defense. Depth is not safety. If you build something important and you hide it 700 miles inside your own territory, and you tell yourself the enemy can never reach it, the only thing you've done is give them 700 miles of flight time to figure out how to kill your air defenses on the way in. The Ghost Corridor didn't beat the Krasukha jamming with better GPS. It bypassed the GPS question entirely. That's not a technical upgrade, that's a philosophy shift. And philosophy shifts are the hardest thing in the world to defend against with a missile battery. Russia's diplomats flew home from Geneva the next morning. The facility fire was still burning when they landed. Now I've got a question for the armchair strategists watching this. The critical decision point in this whole operation was the operator's call to split the 6 drones into 2 groups of 3 for the terminal approach. High-risk move. If the Tor units had stayed dark and engaged optically, that high group dies for nothing and the low group goes in half-blind. So here's the question. Does that split tactic represent brilliant adaptive command, or did Ukraine just get lucky? Type split or lucky in the comments below, and I'll pin the most tactical answer I see. Smash the like button if you think this is the kind of creative asymmetric warfare that rewrites the textbooks. And subscribe, because the next one we're covering is going to make tonight look like a warm-up act. Bye for now.